The dancing plague of 1518 caused up to 400 people to dance in the streets of Strasbourg in a frenzied, uncontrollable manner from July to September. Many danced until their feet bled, some even danced to their death. The final toll is unknown, but reportedly there were up to 15 people dying a day when it was at its worst, from exhaustion, heat stroke, and heart attack. The first to start dancing was a German housewife named Frau Trophia, with more than 30 others joining her within a week. The number of dancers grew involuntarily as if they had fallen under the influence of some kind of magic spell. What probably appeared to be a quirky and odd occurrence at first turned into a fatal, agonizing crisis which needed to be brought to an end. The city council and local physicians at the time gathered and initially diagnosed the problem as a case of hot blood. Since this was during the early 1500s, humorism was still a common medical concept and bloodletting was still practiced. However, they concluded that those suffering from the dancing plague should simply dance themselves free of their affliction. They brought in musicians to encourage the dancing in hopes they would tire themselves out, but this only made the problem worse, luring in onlookers who became enchanted themselves. At this point, more supernatural ideas came about. Perhaps it was a curse brought on by the sinners in the town, so they cracked down on things like gambling. Maybe a ban on music and dancing altogether would end the mania. Finally, the dancers were ordered to go to the shrine of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr who was praised and invoked to combat chorea, an autoimmune disease which caused jerking movements in the face, hands, and feet. It was thought that Saint Vitus was responsible for this curse. Once at the shrine, those afflicted were told to put on red shoes sprinkled with holy water and to hold small crosses in their hands. After a ritual involving incense and Latin incantations, they were apparently forgiven by Saint Vitus. Word was then spread of a successful ritual and the dancing plague had ended. Although there are still some who disagree, nowadays most experts have reached a consensus. This was a case of mass hysteria. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't the only dancing epidemic in the Middle Ages, and it's not the only instance of mass hysteria, also known as mass psychogenic illness or MPI. Although it's just about certain that mass hysteria is to blame for the dancing plagues, MPI itself is not well understood. It is an unsolved history of human behavior. According to Wikipedia, MPI involves the spread of illness symptoms through a population where there is no infectious agent responsible for contagion. The emphasis on symptoms rather than a true illness is an important distinction. Even if we had all of the testing methods in 1518 that we do now, we still wouldn't be able to diagnose the dancing plagues as some kind of detectable disease. In this way, mass hysteria is more of a social phenomenon than a typical illness, even though it may present itself as such. Some of the common symptoms are headache, nausea, abdominal cramps, cough, sore throat, difficulty breathing, vomiting, numbness, and less often, rashes and loss of consciousness. While it may not seem like it at first, all of these symptoms in the case of MPI can be traced back to the mind. Even something as physical and apparent as rashes can be explained by stress and anxiety, with the presence of extraordinary anxiety being a common quality of mass hysteria. Other components include symptoms that have no plausible organic basis, symptoms that are transient and benign, rapid onset and recovery, occurrence in a segregated group, symptoms that are spread via sight, sound, or oral communication, and a spread that moves down the age scale, beginning with older or higher status people. This would mean that both influence and belief play roles in mass hysteria. Let's go over some other examples. The Louisiana twitching epidemic of 1939 started during a homecoming dance in Bellevue. Helen, a senior who attended the dance but wasn't dancing herself, began to experience a sharp pain and twitching in her leg. She wound up going to the hospital. Soon after, 6 other girls from the school started to experience the same symptoms, pain and twitching in their leg. As news of this spread through the school, many students weren't showing up for about a week due to fear of catching whatever this could be. Apparently, some even switched schools. As the other girls started to go to the doctor, the cause of the problem couldn't be diagnosed. As it turns out, Helen was anxious when it came to dancing, and when her boyfriend began dancing with another girl at homecoming, she became nervous, stressed, and jealous. This is when the pain and twitching started. Her subconscious and anxiety were responsible for the manifestation of symptoms. Since the other girls knew of Helen's symptoms and saw her in pain at the dance, they grew anxious as well and overly mindful of the problem, which then caused them to present the same pain and twitching. It's not much of a stretch to simply write this off as people faking an ailment. However, the circumstances fit the diagnosis of mass hysteria perfectly, considering the environment, social tension, and those affected. Mass hysteria most commonly affects children and females. A placebo is any treatment that has no active properties, such as a sugar pill. There are many clinical trials where a person who has taken the placebo instead of the active treatment has reported an improvement in symptoms. Belief in a treatment itself may be enough to change the course of a person's physical illness. So symptoms of mass hysteria are sort of an inverse of the placebo effect, where the expectation of pain, twitching, uncontrollable dancing, and so on can cause them to manifest. If I suggest there's a tingling sensation in your left foot and tell you to focus on it, do you start to feel tingling? This won't be true for everyone, but for some, the suggestion alone is enough to cause a feeling of tingling in the left foot. This is somewhat similar to the symptoms of psychosomatic disorder, where excessive thoughts, feelings, or concerns about the symptoms often exacerbate them or are even the cause of them. A key difference being that mass hysteria happens with a group of people, while psychosomatic disorder is limited to an individual. In a Smithsonian Magazine article, How a Soap Opera Virus Felt Hundreds of Students in Portugal, which I'll talk about more later, sociologist Robert Bartholomew explains that mass hysteria is the placebo effect in reverse. People can literally make themselves ill from nothing more than an idea. In reality, it's a collective stress reaction and found in normal people. In the case of placebo and MPI, the phrase mind over matter is as true as can be. Another popular example of mass hysteria comes from the Middle Ages. A nun from a French convent began to meow. A seemingly innocuous imitation of a cat would then snowball into the entire convent meowing for days on end. Eventually, the meowing became so loud that a small army was sent to investigate. The nuns finally stopped meowing when they were threatened with violence. This is a more simple and rather harmless instance of MPI. The line between mass hysteria and general influence does start to blur a bit more with cases like these though. In more isolated, strict, and tense communities, it's hard to say just how much more susceptible to social pressure we become. Something that plays into this sort of influence through imitation are mirror neurons. Mirror neurons have been found to exist in songbirds, macaques, and humans. There's still a lot to learn in terms of the exact neuroscience behind them, but the purpose of these neurons is easy to understand. Say you want to learn the basics of juggling to be able to juggle 3 balls at once. Now consider these 2 different approaches. First, you print out a list of instructions and tips that are as comprehensive as you could hope for. The list explains the process. Hold 2 balls in your dominant hand and 1 in the other, stand with your elbows bent 90 degrees and your palms facing up, toss one of the paired balls gently, continue this process with your opposite hand, and so on. In this approach, there are no pictures included with this list. In the second approach, you find a video of somebody juggling 3 balls and study it. There are no instructions included with the video. I'm sure there are plenty of people who could learn how to juggle just from the list of instructions alone. More importantly, it's entirely possible to learn how to juggle from that instructionless video as well. If I had to guess, I imagine the video would be of more use to the majority of people rather than the list of instructions. Our ability to learn merely through watching someone else's actions is facilitated through our mirror neurons. You might be realizing how this could play into mass hysteria. While there isn't concrete evidence that mirror neurons and MPI are directly related, to me, it's the most compelling explanation that I've seen, although even if it's true, it's probably just a small piece of the puzzle. An overactive mirror neuron system could explain why nuns started meowing, why high schoolers experienced twitching legs, and why people uncontrollably danced themselves to death. This would also explain why women are more prone to mass hysteria. An underactive mirror neuron system, the opposite of MPI, results in autism, a developmental disorder that interferes with socialization and is 4 times more common in males. That would mean men are more likely to have underactive mirror neurons, autism, and women's are more likely to be overactive, MPI. To quote Robert Bartholomew again from a different article, most and often all those affected are females. In fact, of the 2,000 plus cases in my files that date back to 1566, this pattern holds true over 99% of the time. In the 3 examples I've talked about so far, media hasn't been involved. The terms mass media and mass hysteria are associated in some capacity in a lot of people's minds. I'm reluctant to label the panic from Y2K and other doomsday theories as MPI because other than the fear of a perceived threat, there aren't any symptoms. By definition, mass hysteria leads to medical symptoms, not just panic. As we see with the strawberries with sugar virus, however, mass media is capable of inducing mass hysteria. Strawberries with Sugar was a teen soap opera that ran during 2006 in Portugal. In May of that year, an episode aired where many of the characters got ill with symptoms of rashes, dizziness, and breathing problems. Not long after, these same symptoms started to present themselves in school children, with up to 300 students across 14 different schools catching this so-called virus. No parents were affected. The doctors weren't able to reach a conclusion and eventually chalked this up to mass hysteria. Dizziness and breathing problems are more common symptoms of mass hysteria. Rashes are less common, but definitely not out of the question when it comes to MPI. If the Strawberries with Sugar virus was truly a case of mass hysteria, that would mean no physical contact whatsoever is required for the transmission of MPI. Video media itself is impactful enough to cause mass hysteria to emerge. This would support the idea that mirror neurons play an important role, since you only need to pay attention to someone else's behavior, or in this case someone else's illness, for mirror neurons to be active. Environmental factors play a role in mass hysteria, but not because of the spread of germs or something physical. The social elements of an environment are what contribute to an instance of mass hysteria. Are those in question segregated or secluded in some way? Do they happen to be impressionable kids? Is there generally an unusual amount of stress and anxiety? Mass media can cause mass hysteria given the right conditions in a society. You may be asking yourself at this point, is mass hysteria real? Does MPI exist? According to a research review from 2023 by Wentao Yan, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, diagnosing mass hysteria is an exclusionary process, meaning that a lack of any other physical or scientific explanation is how MPI is identified. Because of this and the differences from case to case, there is still no definitive diagnosis of the pathology of massive psychogenic disorders that can be accepted by the researchers. The study of MPI is murky, incomplete, and controversial. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not real though. There really were people who danced themselves to death in 1518, just as there were meowing nuns and a soap opera sickness. Just because something like fear isn't tangible doesn't mean it's not real. Fear can have both psychological and physical impacts, even though it's purely psychological. Oddly enough, misinterpretations of reality become a part of reality itself. Santa Claus doesn't exist, but because kids are told about him, the myth of Santa Claus has an effect on the real world. The effect being that children will generally behave better in hopes of better presents. I should be clear, kids believing in Santa Claus is not an example of MPI. It's just a way to show that belief in something imaginary still has a real-world impact. There is a cultural element to MPI. If we imagine someone with something like the common cold today and someone with the common cold 400 years ago, their symptoms are going to present in the same fashion, although we have more ways to treat those symptoms today. But instances of mass hysteria will differ from culture to culture, from time period to time period. Typical diseases can have a cultural component as well, but not in the same way. Differences in diet, hygiene, and region are tangible, physical, while differences in social customs and behavior are intangible, psychological. I can safely say there aren't going to be any more dancing plagues anytime soon, although the same can't be said for, let's say, kids displaying symptoms of Tourette's syndrome because they saw a popular German YouTuber posting their tics online, which is what happened in 2019. Cases like these continue to blur the line between mass hysteria and mere influence. There is a clear distinction between recording yourself doing a popular dance on TikTok and being convinced you have Tourette's syndrome. Some of the differences being consciousness and awareness, which during a case of mass hysteria are clouded by anxiety, stress, trauma, and/or social pressures. Another key difference is a lack of symptoms. But where's the line between a healthy society and one that potentially enables mass hysteria? Where's the line between what influences us consciously and what influences us subconsciously? There's a lot that science has been able to tell us about medicine, though it hasn't been quite as illuminating when it comes to psychology and human behavior. Despite the amount of research, there are still gaps of knowledge when it comes to why we think and behave the way we do. As famously said by the British philosopher Emerson Pugh, if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. In the world of psychology and behavioral science, there's a bit more room for disagreement and difference of perspective than in something like cardiology. That being said, here are some ideas that I think could be relevant to mass hysteria. As impressive as our brains are, they're still not perfect. Our memory isn't as reliable as we would like to think. We're subject to various neurological problems. We can be impulsive and irrational, the list goes on. In the case of mass hysteria, there's a particular fault at play, being overly prone to suggestion, influence, and mimicry. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow Flow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about the concept of priming. Priming refers to how we think and behave differently after hearing or reading different words. For example, if we've just been exposed to words that have to do with money and finance, we're more likely to act selfishly and independently. If we've just been exposed to words that have to do with old age, we may walk slower than usual without realizing it. We like to think of ourselves as autonomous and free individuals, but even in a free society, it's just about impossible to outright escape any and all influence. Even if we do, it's usually because we've managed to close ourselves off entirely, a problem that I would consider far worse than being subject to influence like everyone else. The phrase social contagion describes an incidental form of influence. There are some disagreements on exactly what a social contagion is, though generally speaking, it's a spontaneous spread of emotions and behavior through a social network. In today's world, that would include social media as well as work environments, neighborhoods, schools, pretty much any place, medium, or community where social interaction takes place. Examples of social contagions can range from positive, people at a grocery store seeing others put away their cart and choosing to do the same, neutral, changes in fashion, and negative, violence, mobs, rioting, etc. A loose yet modern example of a social contagion is the 2023 Union Square riot, better known for being the Casanet riot. Internet personality and streamer Casanet decided to throw a giveaway of PS5s and gift cards in New York City without a permit. On August 4th, 2023, thousands of people flooded the streets in search of some sick loot drops. The gathering turned more destructive as time went on. The so-called giveaway was deemed a riot, and Casanet was brought into custody, eventually being charged with inciting a riot. Things could have gone worse, with up to $200,000 in damages, 9 injuries, and thankfully no fatalities. In terms of riots, that's relatively tame. This isn't a perfect example of a social contagion. Remember, social contagions are thought to be incidental. They're not deliberate attempts to influence the public. While Casanet claims it wasn't his intention for people to act like this, without his influence, the riot wouldn't have happened. I think this was just a misguided, reckless attempt at having a sensational event of sorts that happened to get out of hand. While oversight could explain the riot, you could argue, how the hell did he not see that coming? He had to have known that throwing a giveaway without a permit as a massive celebrity in New York City would turn into some kind of controversy. Whether or not Casanet intended for this to happen, which I don't think he did, is the difference between a social contagion and mass manipulation. Either way, the correct conditions for this kind of collective behavior were in play. What about a case where intent to manipulate the masses is undeniable? A case where the difference between social contagion and mass manipulation is crystal clear. Logan Paul is both a household name and a controversial figure at this point. It would take a very long video to go through all of the controversies throughout his career, so I only plan on looking at his crypto escapades. Dinkdoink and CryptoZoo. I know, fantastic names. Logan promoted Dinkdoink in 2021, a run-of-the-mill meme coin or shitcoin. This means the only real utility of Dinkdoink and cryptocurrencies like it is high-risk speculative investing backed by marketing hype. These sorts of coins are modern examples of speculative bubbles, the first recorded instance of this being tulip mania. Whether you're investing in tulips in 1635 or you're buying shitcoins today, the only purpose is to sell them at a higher value than you bought them at. These market crazes often cause people to act irrationally, and it's this irrationality that often creates room for large profits in the first place, hence the mania part of the term tulip mania. The definition of mania is mental illness marked by periods of great excitement, or euphoria, delusions, and overactivity, or an excessive enthusiasm or desire, an obsession. While Logan promoted Dinkdoink, he didn't make it clear at the start that he was also directly involved in the creation of the coin. From Dinkdoink's inception to now, Logan has been keeping as much distance as possible from the project, with the exception of marketing it to his fans. According to Time magazine, Logan claims he never sold his tokens or profited from the project, but Time's look into the blockchain, basically a public ledger for cryptocurrency, told a different story. There was an attempt to obfuscate Logan's profits from the project, but it wasn't enough, and it seems pretty clear that Logan Paul did wind up making money off of Dinkdoink. Logan has been involved in another crypto disaster as well, CryptoZoo, which was announced shortly after Dinkdoink. The story of CryptoZoo has a lot more twists and turns than Dinkdoink, although he's still at the very least partly responsible for things falling apart with CryptoZoo, and he's now facing a lawsuit over it. If you want an in-depth look at the entire train wreck that is CryptoZoo, I recommend checking out CoffeeZilla's series on it. For this video, the important takeaway is that Logan Paul is the kind of person who willingly misleads the public for marketing purposes and financial gain. In the case of Dink Doink, instead of social contagion or mass hysteria, it is mass manipulation. It's a shitcoin mania perpetrated by Logan Paul and his team, leading people to buy something that they have been convinced has much more potential value than it really does. Although this is completely separate from mass hysteria, there are still elements of delusion, anxiety in the form of fear of missing out, belief, and mimicry. I believe the same faults in our psychology that lead us to getting scammed are the same faults that lead to mass hysteria. It's our propensity to follow our gut. It's our lack of critical thinking at times. It's our weakness to suggestion. It's our susceptibility to group mentality. It is a complex social, behavioral, and psychological problem. I first started this project because I wanted to make a video with a bit more of a historical theme. I was vaguely familiar with the dancing plague of 1518 and decided looking into that would be a good jumping off point. I wasn't expecting the mass hysteria rabbit hole to lead me to the topics of media and behavior once again. I know my world lens is biased towards looking for those things at this point, but communication is such a universal and pressing issue. If you've been watching my channel for the last few months, you may have noticed that I've been gravitating towards these topics more and more. People have their own ideas about what separates humans from animals. Some say opposable thumbs, others say consciousness. I believe a big part of what makes us human is language and communication. Without the ability to communicate in the detailed way we do, humanity wouldn't amount to much. With this perspective, it's hard not to see the impacts of social media just about everywhere, and when it comes to mass hysteria, I'm not the only one. Going back to the research review by Wentao Yan, apparently there is a new classification of MPI, MSMI, which stands for Mass Social Media Induced Illness. Bear in mind that we don't have a great understanding of MPI in the first place, so any ideas built off of it are going to be less reliable. That being said, the influence and prevalence of the internet cannot be overstated, and MSMI is an interesting approach to the issue. Wentao writes about how the rise of social media removes the need for physical proximity in cases of mass hysteria. We have seen with the strawberries with sugar example that media has been able to cause MPI without physical proximity through TV. However, social media is more personal, accessible, and harbors online communities. Wentao also mentions factors that are likely causing abnormal levels of anxiety in Generation Z, citing ecological issues and stress caused by the lockdowns during the pandemic. I would add that the overwhelming sense of purposelessness among the youth, as well as the pressure to seek validation and status at a younger age online, also contribute to this anxiety. Abnormal levels of anxiety is one of the causal components of mass hysteria. So not only is social media a medium for mass hysteria to spread through, but it could also be increasing the likelihood of MPI due to the anxiety it causes. Quote, "The attention-seeking behaviors which MSMI exhibits are associated with a permanent identity crisis." The example of MSMI provided here is one I briefly mentioned earlier, the German YouTuber with Tourette's, Jan Zimmerman. Due to the viral nature of the internet, Jan wasn't the only source of mass hysteria in this case. Some of those who started to show symptoms of Tourette's also took to social media to post their tics, which in turn exposed more people to the influence of these symptoms. This shows how physical proximity is no longer required for MPI. To quote Wentao again, "During the spread of MSMI, an increasing number of patients with Tourette-like syndrome also emerged on the internet or on television screens in Germany. Hence, the spread of relevant content in social media seems to have induced secondary virtual index cases, while in other countries and regions such as YouTube and TikTok, similar spreads have also occurred and led to further virtual index cases. The term viral is a bit of a double entendre in this context. We are imperfect, impressionable beings. Whether we're convinced we have a mysterious illness to the point where we show physical symptoms, or we're duped into making an asinine investment, or maybe we just hear the word sushi and get hungry, the outside world will always have some influence over us. Influence is a two-way street though. We need to be willing to confront the world around us and open ourselves up to criticism and influence in order to have influence and control ourselves. Finding ways to close ourselves off and reduce our exposure to external forces will just atrophy our ability to handle life in a meaningful way. There is a balance to this. If we submit to any and all influence without thought, we lose ourselves. If we continually reject the world at large, the world loses us. Alright, that's gonna have to do it for this one. Shout out to the best subscriber squad in all of YouTube. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Do you know who came to my house? I didn't go to them. Do you know who came? If you had your pick in the whole United States, who to interview you? You know who came? Katie Couric. She came. I didn't even open the door.